I'm Colin Seale, and I'm joining you all from Las Vegas. And I'm excited because, it's cool that Aquatic Education is having this and I get to be the guest speaker. I'm really excited that you all are here rallying around this theme of every student excels. And I'm excited about the opportunity to share a little bit about my personal story because I really do feel like this theme of every student excels is in very many ways like my story. Because, before I kind of had these different accomplishments that we talked about, I was really like one of those students. Like, I'm talking about from the time I was super young, pre-K. I was this kid that if the teacher was reading a book that I didn't like, or even worse, if she had the audacity to read a book that I did like, but not the right way, I was rushing her, I was grabbing that book, and I was flinging it across the classroom. That was me. And then in 4th grade, I had a science teacher named Miss Lipschitz. And how could you not get in trouble with a science teacher named Miss Lipschitz? And one day she asked me to do a 100-word reflection on my behavior in her class. So I decided, okay, how am I gonna do this? I'm gonna write, I hate science 32 times. And I made sure that I left 4 words so I can say, I hate you too. Okay? This was me in 4th grade. And honestly, by the time I developed into high school, I think it became a lot worse because I was apathetic. I was that student that you could look at and you could see they had the aptitude, they had that sort of inherent thing inside of them, but for some reason, it wasn't clicking. And, just by kind of good fate of going to an awesome middle school right in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I actually ended up going to Bronx High School of Science, which was like a really strong, nationally recognized STEM school before we called things STEM schools. And I remember being at this school and feeling so outclassed. And I actually remember what it felt like to be barely a C student that got tons of D's and the occasional F. And all throughout that time of being one of those students, a lot of these things really didn't start making sense to me until I got older. And I started reflecting on kind of what I was really born into. So I'm born in Brooklyn, New York. My mom is a single mom who is an immigrant, and my family's all from Barbados. And growing up, my dad wasn't around, but it wasn't just that he wasn't around, he was locked up for selling drugs for my entire formative years as a teen. And when I started to really kind of reflect on what it meant to grow up in my neighborhood, where there were a fair amount of gangs, was that I think the only way to really explain it is that maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I had a chance to be a speaker at a Teach for America Las Vegas event where I was gonna be welcoming teachers to our city. And I remember it was like just opening up my closet and looking through my closet and realizing, wait a minute, this is actually crazy. I'm 27 years old, I live thousands of miles away from where I grew up, and I still don't own any red pieces of clothing. Because I grew up in a Crip neighborhood where you always wore blue or gray, and I'm not wearing blue or gray on purpose today. This is pure coincidence. I do not go from conference to conference so I can use this punchline, but it just hit me of how deep this environment can have on your subconscious and the way you go about doing things. So when I started to actually go back and reflect on this, I started to wonder. I was at a school, Bronx Science, that's nationally recognized, that does a lot of the same rigorous sorts of programming so many of your schools do, that have so many enthusiastic learners and high achievers and people that really push themselves. But I was not that kid. And when I was taking a class called technical drawing, which we all had to take, we had to buy this technical drawing kit and have these T-squares so we could do all these architecture sorts of projects. I failed my first semester and I barely passed the second semester, and I was always unprepared. But I really do wish that at some point my teacher might have said, Colin, why are you unprepared? So I could have explained to her that my mom's hours had got cut at her job, and it was very embarrassing to ask her for money that I wasn't sure she was gonna have. If I would have had that opportunity, then maybe I wouldn't have failed. Maybe I would have felt that support. And when you talk about this thing of every student succeeds, the reason I feel it's personal is because it was a counselor that eventually reached out to me and saw this potential and believed in me. And she actually not only believed in me, but she found a way to trick me into believing in myself. How many of you have had that experience before where you actually were able to make a student believe in themselves that you were not sure actually had that belief? These are the transformation specialists, okay? And this is really what I believe it means if you talk about creating a space where every student succeeds. So if we want to talk about every student succeeds, we have to be honest about some of the problems that might be facing our kids outside of the classroom, and we have to own up to the role and say, you know what? No excuses doesn't mean that you ignore reality. No excuses means you create a space where anything is possible despite the reality. And that remains to be my vision to this day. And what I also want to talk about when it comes to every student succeeding is this other piece where when I was a failure as a student, when I was an abject failure as a student, and I had this shift, what started to happen was I started to experience extreme success. Right? I was finally getting A's. When I finished high school, I was taking AP Physics and AP Calculus, and by any measure, like I had now become that person that my mom always thought I could be, that my relatives always thought I could be. But when I'm now a computer science major, and I'm at Syracuse University, and I'm sitting in my first lab for my computer science 101 class. Now, mind you, this was a dot-com boom, right? This was the year 2000. I was thinking maybe I'll be a computer science major because I'll come up with some website with like, blueandgrayshirts.com. Somebody's going to get me $20 million, and I'll just sit there and just be coasting, right? So coding was all about getting that money at that point. But I didn't actually know what I was doing. I had never taken a coding class in my life. And I remember walking into computer lab 101, first lab, doing the equivalent of like the hello world code, right? It was like the most basic thing you can do. And I remember coming in, looked at the paper, looked at the computer screen. I was like, hold up, right? And I'm looking at this paper. I'm like, I have no idea of how to even get started with it. And honestly, in no less than 5 minutes, I see half of my class of 30 kids walk out laughing about how easy this was. And I was like, man, you know what? I'm a smart guy. I got this. So I'm looking back at the paper. I'm looking at my computer screen, and I'm sitting there, I'm scratching my head. 20 minutes pass by, and almost everyone is gone. And by the time we get into a half an hour, I'm realizing I'm the only person left in the lab, but it's just me and the TA. And the TA looks at me and says, are you finished? And I looked at my paper, I looked at my blank computer screen, and I said, yep. And at that point, I decided that college was not going to be for me. College was for somebody else. Because I had never actually known what it felt like to embrace failure, to embrace a struggle. I know what it felt like to be a failure. I knew how awesome it felt to be successful, but I never actually was able to embrace failure. If you want to talk about creating a space where every student succeeds, we need to talk about what it means to create a culture where failure happens frequently. And failure is part of the process of learning. You know, a lot of us do these things where we teach kids about the engineering design process. The engineering design process is premised on constant failure all the time. And had I had a bigger stomach for that, I wouldn't have had a near meltdown that could have caused me to end up leaving school altogether. What ended up happening was I get to my dorm, I call my mom, I'm crying on the phone like, I can't do it. And her response is simply, well, you just have to. I just had to, because I was the great hope, right? I was going to be the first person in my family to do this way. Everyone else, if they went to school, they had to like work 2 jobs and they had to go to school at night. I was this guy. I was the first generation of my family in the country. I had to set the path. And it's a lot of pressure. There was a lot on me, but I felt like the second I kind of learned to embrace struggle as part of the process, something really did click in my head. And as a teacher, that's always been my main rule. Rule number 1 in my classroom, respect the process. Because you just can't introduce these rigorous concepts to people that had never seen it before without having some pushback, I'm sure you all see sometimes when you get new students in your programs, they're like, whoa, you want me to do what? That's too much. That's too hard. At my other school, so you have to really get them to embrace that culture of what it takes to fail often and fail fast and continuously improve. And that's really why we're here, right? Because we recognize there's areas where we might fall short, and we look at it as something we can always aspire to continually improve on. So I kind of wanted to share part of my personal story because I thought it was really relevant to this. But I also want to kind of talk about this last piece, which is a piece of advice that I tend to give a lot of students, but I find that it actually is really applicable to the work we do as teachers. So when you think about what we're getting our kids to do and what we're preparing them for, a lot of us are pretty aware that we don't even know what career they're preparing for at this point. They don't know. It's about trying to create this space where they're going to be able to be ready, regardless of what that challenge is. So when I started to really think about what that takes and what are the kind of habits we need to have extremely unrealistic expectations. We need to be dreamers of the highest proportions. And without huge dreams for what the potential of all kids could be, huge dreams for what the potential of all kids can be, we'll never really be able to shift these dynamics. Because when we dream, we actually encourage other people to buy into that dream. I'm sure when Lisa first started talking about A schools in Arizona for kids that are in low-income areas, people probably thought she was losing her mind. And actually, it's one of the saddest things I had heard. I was at a ceremony in Nashville, and a guy who was having some experiences, the ED for KIPP Nashville was having some challenges opening up the KIPP school there, and he told me about walking around with the president of the NAACP and watching him do the whole tour, the whole talk about the KIPP model, and then the president of the NAACP tapped him on the shoulder and said, you know what, you've got to stop with this thing about all students could go to college. You're not being realistic. And as I heard that, I was blown away because I thought about who gets the privilege of being realistic, right? Because if I ask this guy, well, what about your kids going to college? No question. What about your kids going to a high-performing school? No question. But why is it that when you look at other populations, now we're talking about being realistic? So this is why we actually need to dream. And we need to inspire others to buy into that dream. So as you're here this weekend and you're soaking in all this energy and all this information about what it's going to take to get every student to succeed and to excel, do not forget the power of dreaming of a better future for all of our children. Thank you so much.